The laughter came fast, sharp, and mean. It started with a snort from the front row and rippled through the crowd like a bad wind. "Looks like someone dragged a coyote on stilts into the pen," someone called out. "Did they forget to feed it, or is that part of the charm?" Another chimed in, boots propped on the rail, chewing on a piece of straw more polished than the Colt in the ring. Rusty stood trembling in the center of the dirt arena, legs too thin, coat dull and patchy, ribs visible even under the weak morning light. His ears twitched toward every noise and his head hung low, not from stubbornness, but from fear, or maybe shame. If a horse could feel that. Leaning against the far post was Elias West, silent, hands in his worn jacket pockets, jaw set like granite. He didn't flinch at the words. He'd heard worse, not just today, through life, through war, through grief. His ball cap was pulled low over his brow, hiding the storm in his eyes. People didn't laugh at Elias like they did at the Colt, but they didn't speak to him much anymore either. Not since June died. Not since the ranch faded into dust and memory. A year had passed since the accident. The horse June had been training too wild, too green, had thrown her hard. Broken neck. Elias hadn't blamed the animal, not out loud, but some nights he'd wake soaked in sweat, fists clenched, dreaming of reins snapping and her hand slipping away. Now, here he was, standing in the black hollow auction yard under a sky that looked like it had forgotten how to shine, trying to sell a Colt nobody wanted so he could keep the lights on through the winter. The gas company had already sent the second notice. The tractor hadn't moved in months, and Emily, she needed shoes that didn't leak when it rained. The auctioneer cleared his throat into a microphone that squealed with age. "Starting bid, $20, that's 2-0, folks. He's breathing, at least." The silence that followed stung more than the laughter. Even the horses in the surrounding pens seemed to turn away. A few ranchers smirked, more out of pity than amusement. One man tall, with a crisp black coat and spotless jeans, leaned against the gate like he owned the world. Tom Barron, of course. "West really scraped the bottom of the barrel this time," Tom muttered, loud enough to carry. "That Colt's got less muscle than my coffee." He didn't laugh. Tom didn't need to. His sneer did all the work. His ranch, Dust Rock Acres, sat on land 3 times the size of Elias's, and his bank account had the muscle Elias's horses never did. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the fallout. Not since the day Elias found out Tom had signed a backroom deal to poach their joint contract and undercut Granite Hollow's breeding program right after June's death. The betrayal had calcified into something cold and unmoving between them. $20? The auctioneer tried again. "Anyone? Just enough for lunch and gas home." Elias exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. Rusty pawed the ground, one weak leg trembling. For a moment, Elias considered calling it off. He could load the Colt back up, figure something else out. Maybe sell the old saddle, or that antique feed cart June used to polish every summer. But then, through the drone of indifference and derision, a voice piped up from the back. Small, steady. "I'll take him." The auctioneer froze. Heads turned. Tom raised an eyebrow. Standing just behind the last row of seats was Emily West Elias's daughter, 11 years old, red hair braided, denim jacket 2 sizes too big, holding up a $20 bill with both hands like it might flutter away. The hush that fell over the arena wasn't silence. It was shock. A few people chuckled soft, uncertain, almost guilty. Elias turned slowly. He hadn't even known she'd followed him here. She had school. She'd stayed home. Or so he thought. "Emily," he said, low but firm, stepping toward her. "What are you?" She looked up, eyes glassy but fierce. He's not garbage, Daddy." The auctioneer cleared his throat. Sold, I guess. To the young lady with the brave heart." His voice cracked around the word brave, like he wasn't sure whether it belonged here. Tom shook his head and muttered something under his breath, but didn't speak up again. Elias stood there for a beat longer, the warmth of shame and pride clashing somewhere deep in his chest. Then he walked back toward the ring as Emily hurried down, holding tight to the crumpled bill. They walked together, leading Rusty, who limped but followed back to the trailer. The air had shifted, not by much but enough. The people who had laughed now looked away. The drive home was silent for miles. Rusty swayed in the trailer behind them, hooves scuffing the floor with each pothole. The truck groaned on every turn. Elias stared at the road like it might answer the questions that had been growing in his mind since June's funeral. Emily sat beside him, hands in her lap, thumb tracing the hem of her jacket. Finally, she asked, "Was it wrong?" He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His throat felt thick, like grief and guilt had fused into something unnameable. "No," he said at last. "No, sweetheart, it wasn't wrong." Back at the ranch. Granite Hollow Ranch. Though the sign out front had long since lost its last few letters, the wind swept dust across the empty corral. The barn creaked like an old man in his sleep. Elias led Rusty into the stall once reserved for his best stud. The straw was clean, but the walls bore the bite marks of better days. Emily stood at the door, arms folded. "What should we call him?" she asked. Elias didn't answer. He was watching the Colt drink, the way his body trembled less now, as if just being chosen had steadied him. "I think we should call him Patch," Emily said. "Like a patch on something broken. Or like what Mama used to sew on my jeans when they tore." Elias swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't cry. He hadn't, not even at the funeral. But something inside him felt less frozen. "Patch," he echoed. "Yeah, that fits." That night, long after Emily had gone to bed, Elias stood alone in the barn. The sky outside was dark, moonless. Patch lay in the straw, curled and quiet. Every so often, his legs twitched, as if he were dreaming of running. Elias leaned against the stall door, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. The world had taken a lot from him. His partner, his pride, his peace. But in a dusty auction yard filled with laughter and judgment, his daughter had reminded him that sometimes the smallest voice could speak the loudest truth, and that maybe, just maybe, things that looked like broken beginnings could still lead you home. The wind over Granite Hollow had softened by morning, but the cold still seeped into the bones of the house, creeping under doors and around windows that no longer shut quite right. Elias stood at the kitchen sink, coffee untouched in his mug, staring through the glass at the barn where Patch now lived. The Colt was barely visible in the dim light, but Elias could make out his shape frail, still, like a shadow stitched to the earth. Emily had already pulled on her boots, coat half-zipped, arms wrapped around a bucket of oats that looked twice the weight she could carry. She hadn't asked permission. She didn't need to. There was something in her that wouldn't wait anymore. Elias watched her cross the frozen yard one step at a time, careful but determined. He didn't move to help. Part of him wanted to call her back, tell her to stay warm, to let the animal be. But he knew better. This was hers now. Patch had a new name, a new stall, a girl who believed in him. But belief didn't feed muscle or repair bone. The vet hadn't come yet, and Elias was still unsure if he could afford to bring anyone out. There were more pressing things overdue: power bills. A tractor that hadn't started in months, fencing blown out by the last windstorm. But none of that seemed to matter to Emily, who knelt beside Patch's stall every afternoon like it was church, speaking in hushed tones and brushing the dust from his dull coat with her bare hands. By the end of the week, Elias found himself in the barn more often. Not working, not really, just watching. He fixed a loose hinge on the stall door, hammered in a new plank where the wood had warped. He moved without thinking, like a man whose hands had memory even when his heart didn't. On the 7th morning, a dusty green pickup pulled up the gravel drive. Norah Levin stepped out, scarf tucked under her coat collar, stethoscope looped around her neck. She was the first person from town to visit since June's funeral. She didn't knock, just walked straight towards the barn. Elias met her at the door. "Didn't think I still rated a house call," he said. "I'm not here for you," she replied. "I'm here for the Colt." Patch flinched when Norah approached, but didn't pull away. His legs trembled as she ran her hands along his spine, murmuring in that calm, practiced tone Elias had heard her use with spooked mares and ranch dogs with torn ears. "He's rough," she said after a while. "Undernourished, underdeveloped, probably born breech. But there's light in him. It's weak, but it's there." Elias leaned against the stall door, arms crossed. "You think he'll ever run?" Norah looked over her shoulder. "Not unless someone runs with him." That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Norah stayed for a cup of tea. The kitchen smelled faintly of cedar smoke and something burnt. She pulled a worn notebook from her coat and slid it across the table. "What's this?" Elias asked. "A start," she said. "Thought maybe you could use it. Blank pages tend to listen better than most folks." He didn't open it then, just let it sit under his hand like something alive. They didn't speak much after that. Norah left with a wave and no promise to return, but Elias knew she would. Some people didn't need to say things out loud. Over the next few days, Emily began calling Patch our boy. The Colt still limped, still spooked at loud noises, still refused to let anyone but Emily touch the underside of his neck. But he followed her like a shadow. She taught him to stop at her whistle, to nudge the gate when he was thirsty. Simple things, quiet things, but they added up. Elias noticed, even if he didn't say so. He also noticed the envelope that came in the mail on a Wednesday afternoon. No return address, just the bank's seal stamped in red. Inside, a warning. 3 missed payments, 60 days left before the land would be reassessed for liquidation. He folded the letter carefully, tucked it in the same drawer where June's funeral invoice still lived. That night, he opened the notebook. His first entry wasn't long, just a few lines. "I used to think second chances were for people who hadn't lost everything. But today I watched my daughter talk to a broken animal like it had a soul. Maybe she's right. Maybe something worth saving doesn't have to look strong yet." The days blended. Emily fed Patch before school, brushed him after, walked him slowly through the pasture. Patch limped, but less so. His coat began to shine under the dust. Elias found himself listening for that quiet sound, the rhythmic drag of hooves against gravel, the soft chatter of a girl telling stories to someone who couldn't answer but somehow always understood. One Sunday, Norah came back with hay bales and bandages. She brought a rumor, too. "There's talk the Iron Trail trials are opening registration early this year," she said, tossing a bale into the loft. "They're looking for new blood. Unregistered riders, wild cards." Elias shook his head. "He won't make it out of the corral." "He might," Norah said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Not tomorrow, but maybe in 60 days, with the right training." Emily overheard. That night, she asked if Patch could race. Elias gave a half answer that meant no. She didn't press, she just looked out the window at the barn, where a single dim bulb burned through the dark. A few nights later, Elias found a flyer tucked under the saddle rack, an old one, from the last Iron Trail event June had ever entered. The photo was faded, but her smile was still sharp, eyes shining as she held a ribbon high above her head. He stared at it for a long time, then he put it back without a word. Patch stumbled the next morning, favoring his bad leg again. Emily didn't cry. She just wrapped the leg in a towel soaked with cold water, whispering nonsense while Elias watched from the doorway. "You really think that Colt's going to save us?" he asked Norah the next day. "I don't think that Colt will save you," she replied, "but I think he might remind you how to save yourself." That night, Elias wrote again. "I don't believe in miracles, but I'm starting to believe in the people who do." When the week ended, Patch took his first lap around the pasture without stopping. It wasn't fast or smooth, but it was a lap. Emily whooped. Elias watched from the porch, one hand gripping the railing, the other shading his eyes. He didn't smile, but something in his chest loosened. He didn't need to say it out loud. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years, the road ahead didn't look so empty. The wind shifted in Granite Hollow as February rolled in, bringing with it a gray hush that blanketed the land in stillness. Snow still clung to the corners of the fields, half melted and crusted with dirt, while the sky remained the color of steel for days at a time. At the West Ranch, the days no longer blended into one another. They were marked now by something fragile but pulsing, a rhythm that centered around Patch's slow transformation and the silent belief that had begun to take root in Elias's chest. Patch was improving, not in leaps or sudden bursts, but in quiet inches. His limp had dulled to a faint hitch on his right side. His coat, once dry and ragged, was beginning to shine beneath Emily's patient grooming. The Colt, still startled at strange sounds, still froze when too many things moved at once, but he followed Emily willingly, head lowered in trust. Elias started keeping track, not just in his head, but in the notebook Norah had given him. Every morning, after feeding, and every evening before bed, he scribbled quick, uneven lines. Not about hope, not about miracles. Just facts. The angle of Patch's gait, the way his left eye blinked slower when Emily spoke. The small victories that stacked like quiet bricks. And yet, even with all the small wins, Elias knew it wouldn't be enough. If Patch was going to survive, not just exist, but prove himself, he needed more than a girl's love and a father's notebook. That truth struck hardest on a bitter Thursday morning. The Colt had managed a clean lap around the South Corral without stopping. Emily whooped. Elias clapped once, more out of habit than celebration. But just as Patch turned the final bend, his leg caught a groove in the dirt, and he stumbled. Not badly, he didn't fall. But the sudden jolt left Emily's face pale and tight. That night, Elias sat at the kitchen table long after Emily had gone to sleep, flipping through his old contacts in a cracked leather journal he hadn't opened in years. Most names were crossed out, gone, moved on, lost to time or choices made in harder seasons. But one name remained, Mike Torres. They'd served together once, Elias, Mike, and Tom Barron, before Granite Hollow, before the ranch, before life got twisted and strange. Mike had left the Army after his second deployment and disappeared into the Rockies. Rumor said he'd gone off-grid after a breakdown. Others said he'd become a trainer for troubled horses, working with veterans through something called equine trauma therapy. Elias never asked. They hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. Still, he found the number, punched it in, and let it ring. Mike answered on the fourth buzz. His voice was slow, dry, a little older, a little war-torn. But there was recognition, and when Elias mentioned Patch, Mike agreed to meet. The next morning, Mike arrived in a beat-up blue truck with a bumper held together by rope and optimism. He wore a faded parka, a thick beard, and the kind of stillness that only came from years of falling apart and piecing yourself back together in silence. He didn't say much, just stood in the barn, watched Patch limp a few laps around the paddock, and nodded once. "If you're serious," he said, "you train with me, both of you, every session." Elias frowned. "You want Emily in the ring?" Mike didn't look away. "That Colt doesn't move without her. She's the one he's listening to. If she's out, he's out." So they began. Every other morning, before the sun pulled itself over the horizon, Elias and Emily met Mike at a small training pen behind an old cattle shed Mike had converted into a therapy barn. It smelled of cedar, hay, and worn leather. The sessions weren't long, 45 minutes at most, but they were grueling. Not just for Patch, but for Elias and Emily, both. Mike taught Emily how to lead with breath, not hands, how to use her posture to communicate intention. He showed her how Patch flared his nostrils slightly when unsure, how his ears flicked toward her when he trusted. There were no reins, no saddles, just rope halters, open space, and the patient repetition of gestures until trust replaced instinct. For Elias, the hardest part wasn't the training. It was watching Emily stumble, fall, and rise again without reaching to catch her. Mike didn't let him interfere. "This road," Mike said one day, "isn't for the soft-hearted, but it ain't for the hard-headed either. It's for those who know when to step back." Emily kept at it, though there were cracks. One morning, during a heavy snowfall, a sudden clap from a loose barn door startled Patch mid-circle. He reared slightly, tossing Emily sideways into the soft-packed dirt. She didn't cry, but her hands shook as she stood, brushing snow from her sleeves. That night, she didn't come to the barn, and the morning after, she hesitated at the threshold. Elias found her standing by the porch, boots on but laces loose. Her gaze was fixed on the training field. "You don't have to," he said quietly, stepping beside her. She didn't look at him. "I thought I could do it." "You can," he said. "You just found out how much it costs." She pulled the laces tight and walked away without another word. By week's end, they had settled into a rhythm again. The bond between girl and Colt no longer looked delicate. It looked earned. Patch responded to her presence with a calm that no one else could coax out of him. When she led, he followed. When she paused, he stood beside her, head lowered, breath steady. And yet, Elias knew they needed more than quiet victories. He talked to Mike about Iron Trail, about the early qualifiers, about Ridgerest Arena. Mike scratched at his beard, eyes narrowed. "It's a gamble," he said. "He's not ready for speed, not for crowd noise." Elias nodded. "We don't need to win. Just show up. Just prove we're not broken." Mike studied him. Then the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Then let's show them." The morning of the Ridgecrest qualifier dawned bitter and blue. The sky stretched wide and cloudless, the kind of winter day that looked warm, but bit like teeth. They loaded Patch into the trailer, his frame still slender but stronger now. Emily rode beside him in the cab, staring at the frozen hills, her jaw set with the kind of resolve Elias recognized, because he'd worn it once, long ago. Ridgecrest wasn't large, but it buzzed with energy. Families gathered with folding chairs and thermoses. Riders brushed down gleaming coats. Trainers shouted over the sound of hoofbeats. Patch looked out from the trailer with wide eyes, body taut. Emily led him by the halter, whispering steady reassurances. No one laughed this time, but many stared. They weren't there to win. They were there to finish. When Emily mounted, there was a beat of stillness. Elias held his breath as Patch trotted forward, the limp almost invisible now. The course wasn't complex, just a figure 8 with a few gentle turns, but it was public, loud, and full of the kind of pressure that crushed unsteady hearts. Halfway through, Patch slowed, startled by a shout from the stands. For a moment, Emily hesitated, but then she leaned forward, whispered something only he could hear, and Patch continued smoother, stronger. They crossed the finish line not in first, not even in third, but in fourth place. And Emily smiled, really smiled, the kind that didn't just stretch across her lips, but lit something behind her eyes. Elias watched from the gate, hands curled into fists, heart pounding against ribs that hadn't felt this alive in years. It wasn't the ribbon that mattered, it was the truth behind it. Patch had run. Emily had flown. And Elias, for the first time in what felt like forever, had let go of the weight long enough to feel the wind. The wind over Granite Hollow had turned sharp by the time the envelope arrived, a thick manila one with a logo Elias hadn't seen in years. Iron Trail Circuit Committee. The weight of it made his stomach twist. It wasn't just an invitation, it was confirmation. Patch had placed high enough at Ridgecrest to earn a wildcard entry into the Iron Trail trials. Elias stood at the mailbox longer than he should have, reading and rereading the letter, the paper fluttering slightly between calloused fingers. Back inside, Emily was already lacing up her boots. When he handed her the envelope, she didn't say anything. She just smiled, a quiet, stunned kind of smile that said more than words ever could. The buzz didn't stay quiet for long. Within days, whispers rippled through the county. The skinny Colt from Black Hollow, the same one folks laughed out of the pen, was now headed for one of the most anticipated amateur trials in the region. And not everyone was happy about it. Tom Barron was the first to call. Elias didn't answer the phone that morning, but he listened to the message twice. Careful what road you step onto, Elias. Not every track is built for horses that don't know when to stop. The voice was smooth, but the threat underneath was sharp. At the barn, Mike tightened the girth strap on Patch's saddle and muttered, "He's nervous." Elias glanced over. "Tom?" "No," Mike said. "You." He wasn't wrong. In the weeks leading up to the trial, things shifted. Patch was sounder than ever, his stride more fluid, his focus sharper. Emily rode with ease now, her hands steady on the reins, her voice a compass the colt trusted. But the noise outside the corral was growing louder, calls from local papers, gossip from feed stores, and the unmistakable pressure of eyes waiting for failure. One morning, a letter arrived from the Iron Trail Medical Committee. It cited an anonymous complaint questioning Patch's soundness, citing a suspected chronic lameness that hadn't been disclosed. The implication was clear. Someone was trying to get him disqualified. Elias didn't need to ask who. He took the letter straight to Norah, whose fury lit the kitchen like a struck match. She pulled together a full medical workup within 24 hours, X-rays, reflex checks, gait assessments, and hand-delivered the updated clearance packet to the circuit's regional office. It was aggressive, professional, and undeniable. Patch was cleared within 2 days, but the damage wasn't in paperwork, it was in trust. Elias stood on the back porch that night, watching Emily walk slow circles with Patch under the twilight sky. The girl who had once trembled at the sight of a riding saddle now moved with ease. She didn't need him hovering anymore, and that frightened him more than anything Tom Barron ever could. Still, some ghosts don't stay buried. While reorganizing old storage bins in the tack room, Elias came across a plastic container labeled June Competition. Inside were ribbons, photos, worn gloves, and a handful of DVDs in faded sleeves. One was marked with a date he couldn't forget, June's last race before she died. He hadn't watched it since. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Elias played the disc on the old television in the den. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. June rode with the kind of grace that made people stop talking, Her horse Tidebreaker moved like water, smooth and powerful. But on the second lap, something changed. The horse began to favor its right side. A stagger, then a slip. The fall happened fast, too fast. But when Elias rewound the footage, slowed it frame by frame, he saw it. The markings on the horse's front legs didn't match Tidebreaker's. The animal she rode that day wasn't hers. His hands trembled on the remote. His breath came shallow. Someone had switched horses. Someone had sent June into a race on an unfamiliar animal. And the only person who had both motive and access back then was Tom Barron. Elias didn't sleep that night. He didn't tell Emily, he didn't tell Norah or Mike. He didn't even write it in the notebook, because the truth was like dry kindling, one spark and the whole thing would catch fire. He could expose Tom. He could drag the man through the mud, scream the truth until the whole circuit turned on him. But standing in the dark, Elias knew something deeper. It wouldn't change the past, and it wouldn't help Emily cross that finish line. So he let the truth stay in his chest, hot and heavy, and chose a different kind of revenge, letting the Colt they all laughed at earn his place without tearing anyone else down. The morning of the Iron Trail trial arrived with frost on the grass and steam rising from the pasture like ghost breath. Trucks lined up at the edge of the arena grounds, trailers backing into assigned slots, riders brushing manes and tightening gear with practiced urgency. The air was charged part pride, part fear. Patch stepped out of the trailer steady and quiet. He was still lean, still visibly not bred for speed, but his posture had changed. His ears flicked with interest, his eyes alert, his legs measured. He didn't look like a reject anymore. Emily climbed into the saddle as if she'd been born there. Her helmet clipped, her gloves snug, her jaw set like a challenge. Tom Barron leaned against the rail at the far side of the warm-up pen. His own rider, a sleek teenager on a flawless palomino, didn't glance their way. But Tom did, and when his eyes met Elias's, there was no smugness, just recognition. Something old and bitter passed between them, but Elias didn't blink. He nodded once, then turned away. The race began without fanfare. One by one, riders entered the arena, navigating tight corners and shifting terrain. Most of them were clean, fast, confident. Then came Emily and Patch. They didn't come out fast. They didn't need to. The first lap was smooth, the second tighter. By the third, Patch's breath came heavier, but his stride held true. Then came the final curve, the one they'd practiced for weeks. The sharp left that Patch always hesitated on, and as expected, he faltered, but only for a moment. Emily didn't panic. She shifted her weight, whispered something low, and Patch corrected. They didn't surge ahead, they steadied, and they crossed the finish line in one clean arc of dirt, muscle, and belief. The applause was cautious at first, then louder, then real. They didn't win, but no one laughed. As they exited the arena, Tom approached. He looked older up close, more tired. He opened his mouth like he might say something, some apology, some justification, some last jab. Elias stopped him with a nod. "Thanks," he said simply, "for underestimating us." Then he turned to Emily, reached for the reins, and together they walked away. Not as the winners, but as the ones who never gave up being worth watching. The frost that had clung to the valleys of Granite Hollow finally gave way to early spring. It came not with fanfare, but with the quiet drip of melting snow, the soft stir of wind in the barn rafters, and the subtle swell of life returning to the soil. At the West Ranch, things didn't change overnight, but they did begin to change. Patch was different now, not just stronger in body, but calmer in presence. The Colt who once flinched at shadows now stood steady beneath the weight of a saddle. His stride still carried a hitch, a reminder of where he began, but there was no doubt in anyone's mind anymore he belonged. Iron Trail hadn't handed them a trophy, but it had done something better. It had seen them, all three of them. Emily, Elias, and the horse they refused to give up on. The calls started soon after. At first, it was reporters' regional magazines wanting a feel-good story to run on the back page. Then came the sponsors, and finally, the buyers. One call came from a renowned trainer out of Amarillo. His voice was crisp, professional, and detached in a way that made Elias's fingers tighten around the receiver. He'd seen Patch's run, liked what he saw, offered $150,000, cash, no haggling, said he could turn Patch into a therapy mount for injured veterans or a pasture pony for some Texas estate. Either way, he'd be well taken care of. Elias didn't respond right away. He thanked the man and hung up without a commitment. That night, he sat with the numbers. Mortgage payments still hovered like vultures. Equipment bills loomed. There were fences to fix, feed to buy, and a roof that wouldn't survive another hail season. $150,000 would pull them out of the hole, give Emily a future, give him breathing room. But when he looked out the window, he saw Emily and Patch walking the fence line under the fading amber of a Colorado dusk. Her small figure beside the Colt's lean frame, step for step, like a dance neither had learned but somehow always known. Emily said nothing at dinner. She didn't ask about the phone call. But after the dishes were cleared and the silence hung too heavy, she spoke. "I don't want to sell him." It wasn't a plea, it was a truth. Stated plainly, like the way children name what adults are too afraid to admit. "He's not a thing," she added, her voice almost too quiet to catch. "He's part of us." Elias didn't argue. He couldn't. Not when everything in him echoed the same. He didn't call back. Word spread fast that Patch wasn't for sale. Some scoffed. Others called it foolish. A few called it admirable. Elias didn't care either way, because for the first time in years he wasn't living by what others thought of him. He was living by what he'd nearly forgotten, his own measure of worth. Mike stopped by one afternoon with a clipboard and an idea. A local nonprofit was launching a pilot program, an equine therapy initiative for children who had lost a parent. They wanted to open their first outreach center in rural Colorado. They needed someone who understood what it meant to lose something and find healing in hooves and hay. Mike said one name. Elias said yes. Within months, the old corral had been refurbished, the barn cleaned out and converted. What was once a dusty, half-forgotten stretch of land became the home of a new initiative. Brighter Hollow, a sanctuary where horses and children alike could learn to breathe again. Patch became the heart of it, not because he was the strongest or fastest, but because he was the most real. Every scar on his leg, every muscle in his stride, told a story not of perfection, but of persistence. Children came in quiet at first, some withdrawn, others angry. Emily was the first to meet them at the gate, her voice soft, her hands patient. She never gave instructions, just introduced Patch, then stepped back and let something unspoken pass between them. And something always did. One boy, no older than 9, came, week after week, but never spoke. One afternoon, Patch nudged the boy's shoulder with his nose. The child reached up, placed his palm against the colt's jaw, and whispered one word. Safe. Elias watched from the barn door, hands in his pockets, the ache in his chest not from sadness, but from the kind of gratitude that left you hollow and full all at once. News traveled, more families came, volunteers signed on, donations trickled in, and slowly the West Ranch stopped being a burden and became something else entirely, a place where healing wasn't handed out, but grown, step by step, hoof by hoof. As for Tom Barron, his name began to slip out of conversations. Rumors of debt and mismanagement swirled. His horses were sold off quietly. His land listed in the county records. No one celebrated his fall. And Elias didn't gloat. He simply whispered to himself late one evening while stacking hay, "You can't own what you never understood." On a mild spring day, Elias stood by the paddock fence. Patch grazed nearby, his coat glinting beneath a sun that had finally shaken the chill from the valley. Emily sat on the porch, a sketchpad balanced on her knees, pencil dancing across the page. She was drawing Patch again. But this time she added something else, a banner above the colt's head, shaded in the soft lines of a child's hand, with words that needed no translation. "Not a prize horse, just the one who showed us the way home." Elias didn't speak. He didn't need to. He looked at his daughter, at the horse they never gave up on, at the ranch that had found its breath again, and realized something that would stay with him long after the fences were mended and the grass turned gold again. Some hearts aren't meant to be bought. They're meant to be trusted, and when you do, they carry you farther than you ever imagined.